3 miles beneath the Pacific Ocean, 2 a Soviet nuclear submarine sat in absolute darkness, 3 crushed by pressure no human being could survive, 4 carrying ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads, and the bodies of 98 men. 5 the Soviets had no idea where it was. 6 the CIA knew exactly. And somewhere in a conference room in Langley, Virginia, a group of men in suits looked at each other and asked a question that had never been asked before in the history of human civilization. Can we steal it? Not photograph it. Not map it. Not send down a camera drone and call it a day. Seal it. Physically lift a 2,000-ton Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean floor in secret while Soviet naval vessels watched from the surface without the Soviets ever understanding what was happening right beneath their feet. This is Project Azorian. And if you think you know what Cold War espionage looked like, you are about to be completely wrong. How a nuclear submarine just disappeared. Let's start at the beginning, because the context matters. In late February 1968, a Soviet Golf II class ballistic missile submarine, designation K-129, departed from its base in Kamchatka, Russia on what should have been a routine patrol of the North Pacific. It carried a crew of 98. It carried 3 SSN-4 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. It carried cryptographic equipment, code books, and intelligence materials that any Western agency would have traded almost anything to get their hands on. It never came back. The Soviet Navy launched one of the most extensive search operations of the Cold War era. Dozens of ships, months of searching. They found nothing, not a single piece of wreckage, not a survivor, nothing. There was no public announcement. The Soviet government told the families almost nothing. In the rigid information control of the Soviet state, 98 men simply ceased to exist. But here's what the Soviets didn't know. The United States had spent years developing a classified deep-sea listening network called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, an extraordinary grid of hydrophone arrays anchored to the ocean floor across vast stretches of the Pacific and Atlantic. Its entire purpose was to track Soviet submarine movements. And on the day the K-129 died, SOSUS heard it. The catastrophic implosion of a pressure hole at extreme depth produces a distinctive acoustic signature. SOSUS detected it, triangulated it, and gave American analysts something priceless: coordinates. The K-129 had sunk to approximately 16,500 feet below the surface, nearly 5 kilometers down in an area northwest of Hawaii. The Americans said nothing, because they were already thinking about what came next. The audacity of the plan. Let's be precise about the depth we're talking about. 16,500 feet. That is deeper than Mount Olympus is tall. Deeper than the entire stack of the world's tallest buildings placed end to end multiple times over. At that depth, the water pressure is approximately 7,500 pounds per square inch. No human diver could ever reach it. The technology to operate at those depths with any kind of precision or mechanical control barely existed in theory, let alone practice. The CIA looked at all of this and decided to try anyway. Under Director Richard Helms and later with the direct authorization of President Richard Nixon, the agency launched what would become one of the most expensive, most technically complex, and most operationally daring covert operations in American intelligence history. The classified codename was Project Azorian. The budget was officially reported at over $350 million, which, adjusted for inflation, translates to well over $2 billion today. $2 billion. In the early 1970s, for a single intelligence operation. But the money was only the beginning. The real problem was cover. You cannot simply park a specialized government salvage vessel over a Soviet submarine wreck site and start lifting. The Pacific Ocean is big, but Soviet naval intelligence is not blind. Any operation would need an explanation, a cover story so plausible, so completely above suspicion, that even sustained Soviet surveillance would produce nothing actionable. The CIA's solution was, in retrospect, almost absurdly brilliant. They recruited Howard Hughes. The billionaire in the ship. If you know anything about Howard Hughes, you understand why this worked. By the early 1970s, Hughes was one of the most famous and most eccentric figures in American public life, a billionaire industrialist, aviation pioneer, and Hollywood producer who had retreated from public view into a reclusive existence that fueled endless speculation and mythology. He was also known for investing in genuinely strange, genuinely large-scale engineering projects. When the Hughes organization announced plans to construct a revolutionary deep-sea mining vessel to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor, it was odd, but not impossibly odd. This was Howard Hughes. Odd was his brand. The ship was called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Publicly, it was presented as a commercial venture into a new frontier of deep-sea resource extraction. The cover story was technical enough to be credible, vague enough to resist scrutiny, and attached to a name famous enough that people accepted it without asking too many questions. Secretly, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was something else entirely. The ship was custom engineered from the keel up for a single purpose. At its core was a feature called a moon pool, a concealed chamber in the center of the hull opening directly to the ocean below, through which a massive mechanical lifting system could be deployed and retrieved without ever being visible from the outside. The lifting system itself, codenamed Clementine, was a mechanical claw of extraordinary scale and complexity. We are talking about a structure the height of a multi-story building, designed to descend nearly 5 kilometers through open water, locate a specific target on the ocean floor with minimal visibility, grip the corroded and compressed hull of a submarine, and then lift the entire thing, slowly, steadily, safely, back to the surface. Engineers worked on the system for 6 years. 6 years. To build a mechanical claw that had to work perfectly once at the bottom of the ocean in the dark with no possibility of a test run. The operation in the summer of 1974, the Hughes Glomar Explorer sailed to the recovery site northwest of Hawaii and took up its position over the wreck of the K-129. Soviet naval vessels arrived to watch. They circled the Glomar Explorer. They observed a ship conducting what appeared to be deep-sea mining operations. They saw nothing alarming. The Clementine descended. 5 kilometers of water, darkness, crushing pressure. The claw found the submarine, a corroded broken hull that had been sitting on the ocean floor for 6 years, and engaged its grip. Then the lift began. The ascent took days. Moving a 2,000-ton object 5 kilometers through water, suspended on a pipe string from a surface ship rocking in Pacific swells, requires a constant, delicate adjustment of tension and stability that pushes engineering to its absolute limit. The crew of the Glomar Explorer worked in shifts, monitoring systems around the clock, knowing that a single catastrophic failure would end the operation and potentially expose everything. They were almost there. And then, according to declassified CIA documents released in 2010, something broke. A structural failure in the claw mechanism. A section of the submarine, the larger section, containing the nuclear missiles and the missile compartment, broke free during the ascent and fell back to the ocean floor. The CIA recovered approximately 1/3 of the K-129. What they found, and what they did with it, even a partial recovery, was remarkable. From the section they brought up, analysts retrieved cryptographic materials, equipment of significant intelligence value, and information that reportedly reshaped American understanding of Soviet submarine capabilities and communications systems. The exact details remain classified to this day. But it is what happened next that has stayed with historians, and with anyone who thinks seriously about the Cold War. Inside the recovered section of the K-129, they found the remains of 6 Soviet sailors. The crew of the Hughes Glomar Explorer held a burial at sea for them, with full military honors. The ceremony was filmed. American sailors and CIA personnel stood at attention as the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners, men who had died in service to an adversary nation, were committed to the ocean with dignity and respect. In 1992, 18 years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the Cold War had formally ended, CIA Director Robert Gates reportedly provided a copy of that burial film to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. A private gesture offered between former enemies, acknowledging a shared humanity that the politics of the era had never officially permitted. Think about what that means. At the height of the Cold War, in the middle of a covert operation designed to steal Soviet military secrets, American intelligence officers paused to bury their enemies dead with honor. And then, 2 decades later, they told the Russians what they had done. The legacy Project Azorian remains, to this day, the deepest covert salvage operation ever attempted in recorded history. The engineering it required did not exist before the mission demanded it. The cover operation was so effective that it held for years, and even after a partial leak to the press in 1975, the full operational details were not officially declassified for decades. It succeeded only partially. The nuclear weapons were never recovered. The full intelligence windfall the CIA had hoped for was never realized. And yet the operation is studied to this day in intelligence and engineering circles as proof of a principle that seems almost too optimistic to be true, that with sufficient resources, sufficient ingenuity, and sufficient patience, the impossible is negotiable. The CIA spent $2 billion, recruited a billionaire, built a ship from scratch, and lowered a building-sized claw to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They did it in 1974. The question that should keep you awake at night isn't what went wrong. It's what they've learned to do since. If this story hit differently than you expected, that's the point. Share it with someone who thinks the Cold War was just about missiles and spies. Subscribe for the next one, Operation Ryan, where the Soviets became so convinced a U.S. nuclear first strike was imminent that the world came closer to ending than almost anyone realized.